collections in the museum is the Marple collection. These models and a couple of others were made by a fellow named Ed Marple. Now, Ed was a dental technician. He owned his own dental laboratory in Tucson, Arizona. And he was not a really healthy person. He knew he was going to retire early, and he looked for a hobby that was as difficult as his work. And this model shipbuilding is what he zeroed in on. So he tried out a couple of models. The first two models down at this end of the case were actually made from kits. And by the way, you can buy those kits today if you'd like to get into this hobby. But these models are made, these first two models are made from solid wooden hulls that you get in the kit. It still takes a lot of work to make them look as good as this. So it isn't that simple. But Ed tried it that way, and he decided this was a hobby he really could get into. From that, he moved on to building models from scratch. In other words, he got the plans and the materials, and he just worked right from the beginning, and he built them like real ships, with frames and keels and planking on the outside. And this model here and the second one, the one behind it, will show you that the little dots on the side of the ship, those little dots represent, well, they are dowels, small wooden dowels that hold the planks to the frames. In other words, just the way real ships were built. By the way, the name for those dowels is tree nails, or it's usually just pronounced as trunks. So it's interesting that Ed decided to do that and build models that way. All the models that he built after the first two are made that way. But the first two, he used a different kind of wood for those trunks. So on these first two models, they're easy to see. The other models, they blend in because he used the same kind of wood that's on the planking itself. So that was just his technique. Now, these models all represent ships that sailed at one time or another. They have their own histories. Some are very interesting histories. And we have the ship over on the far side was one of the fastest, I forgot the name of the ship. What kind? Oh, clipper ship. The ship on the far side was one of the fastest clipper ships in its day. It broke all kinds of records. And this ship right here is a whaling ship. This ship is actually still floating. It's in Mystic, Connecticut. It's the last surviving whaling ship used on the East Coast, the Charles W. Morgan. And if you go to Mystic Seaport in Connecticut, you can get a tour on this little ship. It's wonderful. And again, they all have histories. This ship here is the HMS Endeavour. And this is Captain Cook's first ship. On his first voyage, he went into the Pacific looking for a mythical southern continent, at least mythical at the time. And he selected this ship because he wanted to have a lot of space on the ship to store materials. He had been in the Americas doing a lot of work on maps and charts, and he knew how difficult it was when something broke or you lost something. So he wanted this kind of ship that's kind of a bulky looking ship because it was actually a ship that carried coal around England. And so he selected this ship for that room. The Endeavour, we have there's a replica of the Endeavour that was built in Australia that travels the world, and maybe someday that'll come back here again. But it has been here at Port Hueneme at one time. But it's very roomy. And what you see on the replica, the internal area, the thing was that there were a lot of private cabins for the crew on that ship, the scientists on that ship actually. They were naturalists and cartographers. And Captain Cook wanted them to all have their own space. So he made a whole bunch of small cabins for them. And you had to really stretch to get in them, but once you were in, you had some space to work in. And that's, if you ever see the replica, it shows that. So the Endeavour was a wonderful experience, and of course Captain Cook is a great story. Plenty of books to read about Captain Cook. Now, if we move further on, we have the Royal George. This is a ship that was built in 1756, and it's a wonderful 108-gun ship. By the way, you'll notice that Ed Marple's technique was to have the gun ports open on one side and closed on the other. So as this side of the ship, the gun ports are closed, but on the other side the gun ports are open and the guns are extended. And that was just the way Ed liked to work. Now, this ship, the Royal George, had a very interesting ending. It actually sank in Portsmouth Harbor in about 70 feet of water. And it turns out that the story goes, it was a very busy day on the ship. It was getting ready to go to the Mediterranean. They were bringing stores out to the ship. A lot of sailors' relatives were actually visiting on the ship. And they knew that there was a small leak below the waterline, right on the starboard side here. And so the carpenter had requested that he have time to fix that leak before they leave for the Mediterranean. So they didn't want to go back to the dock. They were at anchor in the harbor. And so what they did is they took the guns on the port side, the far side, extended them all the way out, and took the guns on the starboard side here and pushed them into the center of the ship. The ship heeled over, bringing this small section, this opening up out of the water so the carpenter could work on it. This opening, by the way, was an inlet to a pump, so they could just pump seawater up and flush the decks. So the carpenter goes over the side and he's working away and fixing that leak. And then it turns out the weather didn't get really bad, but just a little bit choppy. So water started coming in to the gun ports on the port side. And because this was a ship that was getting ready to deploy for a long period of time, there were a lot of new officers and new crew aboard. And when they tried to explain to the officers that the water was coming up and it was getting dangerous, the chain of command just didn't work because they hadn't worked together before. And before long, water came in the far side. The ship started going way, way over. The guns that were in the center were not secured. They crushed, moved to the far side and caused it to roll even further. And it just, sooner or later, it had too much water in it and it finally started to sink. It turns out there was a good-sized ship on the far side. Actually, we understand it was a ship that had brought barrels of rum to be stored on the ship as it went on its cruise. So as it started to sink, it pulled that small ship down, and it actually sank straight down, right into the water. Now, 70 feet of water only comes up to about here on the ship. So the ship was left in Portsmouth Harbor with the masts actually sticking out of the water, and the bowsprit, even the end of the bowsprit was visible, at least at low tide, I imagine. And it sat there for a long time. It deteriorated over the years. Now, it sank in the 1780s. And it turns out it was a problem. It was a navigation hazard in the harbor, a very busy harbor. Even today, it's one of the busiest in the world. But still, it was a busy harbor, and it was also a big fishing port. A lot of fishermen worked in that area. And there was a complaint about 1840. The fishermen were still complaining that their nets were getting caught on this ship. Now, 1840 was about when some reasonable diving could be done. And so they arranged to have divers go down and try to move away some of the debris so the fishermen's nets wouldn't get caught on it. And that's what they did. The divers went down, cleared the area to some extent. And that was the point where another English ship was found, a ship called the Mary Rose. And that was a ship that has been brought up and salvaged for a museum anyway. And that was a ship that was active when Henry VIII was the King of England. Now, in addition to these models in this case, we have 3 more models that Ed worked on. By the way, we have every model that Ed ever worked on or made is here in the museum. So we're really proud of that. We have another one that's quite impressive, and we want to move over to the Sovereign of the Seas.